Good morning. How's the wall look? Better? Good? They're going to touch up the sides today, so you can tell me the truth this time, okay? After Mass, if you don't like it. Actually, no, it's my day off, so leave me alone after Mass. I'm kidding. Oftentimes, we like to have a modern depiction of Jesus as like a big teddy bear who, sprinkles, pixie dust and happiness and everything. But if we look at the gospel passage here today, he's saying, enter through the narrow gate. The gate to perdition or destruction is wide, and many pass through it, and the gate to life is narrow and constricted, and those who find it are few. And it's the role of the priest to preach the gospel. That's our first responsibility as priests, is to preach the gospel. And sometimes that means helping others to find the way through that narrow gate. Sometimes that's difficult. Sometimes that's done in delicate or not so delicate ways. Sometimes it would be easier to just look to the road to destruction, but then when we know that it's destruction, we know what comes at the end of that road, and we see many people following it, we have to say no. And so the role of the priest is to preach the gospel as Jesus did, which wasn't always popular. Do whatever you would have them do to you. This is the law and the prophets, right? To love God and to love neighbor as yourself. Who is my neighbor? A man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, right? The Good Samaritan. We recognize that we are called to look and recognize everybody around us as neighbor, but then to truly love that neighbor is to help them to make their way through the narrow gate, to move away from that broad road that leads to destruction. And so to preach the gospel, we need priests. To have the sacraments, we need priests. And we need more priests. We just had 3 of the old guys retire, or they're retiring like on Friday, I think. And we're fortunate that we had, I think, 4 or 5 priests ordained this year. Next year, we'll have 5 priests ordained, but the year after that, I think we don't have any priests that are going to be ordained. And so when we talk about praying for vocations, I've said this numerous times, we ought not talk about praying for vocations in just some nebulous way, but praying for vocations that God may call men from our community, right? Or rather that the men that are being called by God from this community may be able to hear and answer him. There is no shortage of vocations to the priesthood. There is a disability to hear God. There is no shortage of holiness. There is a disability to hear God and to do his will. It's easier to go down that wide road that leads to destruction. It's easier to do that which the world would want. It's difficult to hear the voice of God, to do his will, to follow him. So we must pray that the Lord send laborers into the harvest, because indeed the harvest is great and the laborers are few. So pray in a real serious way. When you see young men who are faithful, who are serving the church in some way, to ask them if you considered the priesthood. I was never asked that as a child. It's kind of strange if you think about it. Nobody ever, well, actually, no, if you knew me as a child, I was basically like I am now, just with less filter. So maybe it is not strange that nobody asked me that. But do we see that as a possibility? Do we see that as a good thing? Do we see that as a blessing? Right? To be able to look to a young man and say, maybe God's calling you to be a priest. Unfortunately, there's sometimes a mindset among people that say, no, I don't want my son to live that life. I don't want my grandson to have that. I want children and grandchildren. And I don't want that. But indeed, it's a beautiful life. It's a beautiful life of being able to preach the gospel and lead others to that narrow gate, to help others to know, love, and serve the Lord. So I'm not just talking about the altar servers, right? About promoting vocations with them, after Mass when you see Bob, have you ever considered being a priest? Or maybe the Zaccanino boys would make more sense. But just your sons, your grandsons, to recognize that God may indeed be calling them. Help them to hear the voice of God. Today marks 8 years for me as a priest, and it truly has been a beautiful journey to see others grow closer to Christ, to mourn with others as death, which is inevitable, comes about as tragedy, can wreak havoc in families, but to see the joy of conversion. To see the joy of conversion, of people growing closer to Christ, of people growing in holiness, of people desiring to do that which is the will of God. People going to the narrow gate. But also pray for your priests as well. Pray for us that we may grow in holiness as well, that we may strive to proclaim the gospel as best we can, so that those who hear it may indeed move towards and through the narrow gate. And so today we ask the Lord that He would indeed send more laborers into the harvest. We ask that the Lord would sanctify those of His ministers, His priests, who serve you, who lead you to the narrow gate. Pray for the priest who baptized you, the priest who gave you your first communion, who confirmed you, who married you, who heard your confession that one time when it was really difficult or you really needed to hear something important. That priest who was there for you when you were suffering. That priest who put his foot in his mouth and alienated you and did something to cause great harm to you. Pray for him because he's human. Pray for all the priests that you've encountered in your life, that we may indeed grow in holiness, that we may indeed strive to preach the gospel at all times, and that we too may find our way through the narrow gate.